This is for the Hispanic, Latino, Latinx people that say this. We don't owe African Americans anything. We don't have to identify with being black. They never did anything for us. Here it goes. Now, your video goes on to talk about immigration during specific time periods in U.S. history, to lead up to saying that African Americans helped establish the 1965 Hart-Celler Act. And if it wasn't for y'all, people from Latin America wouldn't be able to migrate into the United States. But you left out a lot of key points in that history timeline. You started off with 1917. Well, prior to 1917, that southern border was an open border. And many people from Mexico had families on both sides of that border. And they started closing that border down due to xenophobia. And do you know what was happening in 1917 at that border? Gasoline baths. People coming across that border were getting sprayed down with gasoline and toxic chemicals every 8 days in order to cross that border and work or visit their families. And this practice continued on for 40 years. It is also what inspired the gas chambers in Nazi Germany during World War II. Then you move on to the 1940s, where you continue to see mostly European immigrants and Mexican migrants coming across that border. This was also during the time of the Bracero program, which the government used to recruit Mexicans for cheap labor. And when I say cheap, I mean cheap. Poor working and living conditions and barely making any money. When the U.S. wanted to end the Bracero program in the 1960s, it got a lot of pushback from white employers, because that means they would have had to actually pay fair wages to U.S. citizens. You then go on to say that the reason why you didn't see a whole lot of migration coming up from Latin American countries, particularly predominantly black Latin American countries, was because the U.S. wasn't allowing it to happen. When in fact, there wasn't a whole lot of migration because there wasn't need for migration. And they didn't have a cap on migration from Latin American countries at the time because they were exploiting labor from Latin American countries. Which brings us to the 1965 Hart-Celler Act that you said African Americans pushed for to benefit people from the Latin American diaspora. Now, this act mostly benefited people coming from the Eastern Hemisphere. It helped some African migrants, but mostly it benefited Asians. And as you can see by your own graphic that you posted, you see a lot more Asian immigration coming in at that time. But for Latinos, by contrast, the Hart-Celler Act made the U.S. less accessible, which brought Latino immigration under numerical limit for the first time. So it actually didn't help, it made it worse, which has caused extreme xenophobia and racism of brown people coming across that southern border. And it also enables and perpetuates human trafficking of migrant workers for slave labor. So not only was your video misleading, but it perpetuates division amongst black and brown people, and it's not the flex you thought it was. Oh, and by the way, the vast majority of people coming across that southern border are indigenous to the Western Hemisphere and cannot be illegal on stolen lands.